I was typing and my finger slipped. Where I meant to write government, I instead wrote giverment. The O and I are close to each other on the keyboard. Just on the point of correcting it, I saw it objectively and thought, isn't that what socialism is? Giverment? A fitting metaphor for the rest of this report on the other side of the intro. Billionaire Peter Thiel says that academia is at a level of corruption comparable to that of the Catholic Church prior to the Reformation. He's been calling for reform for a while. One of the unexpected ways that universities are like the Church is that they're tax exempt. Not only do they not have to pay taxes, but they obtain additional revenue from state and federal subsidies. In other words, money from the taxpayers. With billions in revenues, these schools operate less as institutions of higher learning than as hedge funds. See Patrick Ben-David talk about it here.
Let's take a look at what they do with this windfall of cash that they get. They must really give back to community, right? You ready? They hoard it. They organize non-stop donation drives and build these amorphous hedge funds called endowments. It's never enough. Let me give you a stat here. Harvard, a very reputable school, has an endowment of over $36 billion, which, fun fact, according to the IMF, would put Harvard between Bolivia and Bahrain as the 96th largest economy in the world. And based on data from the United Nations, there are over 100 countries with smaller economies than the Harvard endowment alone.
Why Harvard is of interest is that back in 2017, they fired their internal investment staff to obscure what they were investing in from their own faculty and alumni. The investments were so sketchy that they wanted to outsource what the endowment was doing to private equity firms. The Wall Street Journal reported, about half the 230 employees at Harvard Management Company will leave as part of a sweeping change by the university's new endowment chief, N.P. Narvekar. The endowment will shut down its internal hedge funds and let go traders by the middle of the year, with other layoffs occurring by year end. So what was Harvard investing in that made them feel like they had to hide it? Answer: catastrophe bonds. Disaster capitalism is one thing if you're profiting off the collapse of a third world country, but it's quite another if you're betting against America, and people at the university who are from some of these regions find out about it. This presentation is almost a companion piece to an earlier report I did on the subject of catastrophe bonds. I included this video from the BBC explaining it.
Catastrophe bonds are basically a bet against natural disasters, like hurricanes or earthquakes. Insurers issue the bonds, and investors get paid interest every year. At the end of the term, they get their money back. But if there is a catastrophe, then the insurers get to keep all the money to cover their losses, and the investors lose everything.
One of the newest forms of catastrophe bonds was the so-called pandemic bond, which was invented in 2017. Whereas normal bonds were trading at 1% to sometimes even 0%, pandemic bonds were offering 8% returns to pension funds. Where else could you get such a sweet deal? So the working class saw their savings invested by police pension funds, firefighter pension funds, teachers union pension funds, and so forth. The only problem was that if a pandemic was announced, the bank got to keep all that money. In 2018, just a year after pandemic bonds were invented, the World Bank joined forces with the World Health Organization, as you can see from this article. The World Health Organization and World Bank joined forces to strengthen global health security. The very next year, when the World Health Organization declared a pandemic, trillions of dollars changed hands from the working class to the banking system. That was the previous report. By the way, you can see Stephen Schwartz on Harvard's website pitching catastrophe bonds here. We read, in catastrophe bonds, pandemics, and risk securitization, I focus on using risk securitization, a relatively recent and innovative private sector means of insuring otherwise uninsurable risks, to insure pandemic-related risks. Risk securitization depends on investor demand to purchase catastrophe bonds. Mr. Schwartz is on record as leading the charge for promoting catastrophe bonds in general, and pandemic bonds more particularly, to Ivy League universities. So what you have here is disaster capitalism. The New York Times referred to the Mad Max economy, a multi-billion-dollar-a-year collection of industries that thrived when things got really, really bad. Economist Adam Smith warned about this in The Wealth of Nations back in 1776. He said that there were three basic classes of people in any economy. The first was people who earned money through wages. The second was people who generated profits from real estate. Both of these classes, wrote Smith, saw their fortunes tied to the country. As the fortunes rose of the country, so did their fortunes. As its fortunes fell, so did theirs. So these people were loyal to the nation because in a very literal sense, their fate was tied to it. There was a third class, however, who profited as the country collapsed. the international financial class. Of them, Smith wrote, "But the rate of profit does not, like rent and wages, rise with the prosperity and fall with the declension of the society. On the contrary, it is naturally low in rich and high in poor countries, and it is always highest in the countries which are going fastest to ruin." He warned about these globalist financiers who got rich by engaging in the controlled demolition of societies. Smith warned never to allow this class of person to get anywhere near legislators, because they would always champion legislation that collapsed a country. We're in a situation now where, through insurance fraud called pandemic bonds, people are essentially getting rich by shutting down the economy. Like the Wimbledon Committee, they just happened to take out pandemic insurance right before the most recent global health crisis in case sporting events were shut down. So though under a capitalistic system, you'd think they'd lose money when tennis matches stopped, they actually made billions through pandemic bond payouts. Harvard seemed to have the same foreknowledge. Imagine that. Because of this insurance scam-based economy, you had places like Target encouraging riots that were burning down its own stores and actually donating to the rioters because they were making more money on the catastrophe bonds than they were through selling things in their retail outlets. Harvard acted little different. So as the rest of the planet suffered economically, and colleges all around the country were shutting down and turning students away, Harvard couldn't care less. Students or no students, they were raking in the profits. Yet more proof that they're more of a hedge fund than an institution of higher education. This is why Harvard played up the so-called global health emergency, leading by example and encouraging teachers' unions and public schools to panic and shut down. The panic fed Harvard's profit margins. Teachers all up and down the educational ladder looking up to the Ivy League for guidance had no idea that these universities had an interested economic motive in a global lockdown. They thought that places like Harvard were telling them to panic because they had some special esoteric scientific knowledge, or that they thought that plexiglass sneeze guards would ward off diseases. No. Harvard and other hedge funds masquerading as universities had a very different motive in mind in stoking the fears and ramping up the unreasoning panic. Just to return to Peter Thiel's claims that academia is at a level of corruption approaching that of the Catholic Church before the Reformation, could any thoughtful man disagree? If you like this video, you'll love the New American Magazine. You can buy a subscription or donate to help more videos like this get made. Think of it as your own electronic swear jar. Every time you slip and lose your temper, you put a quarter in the metaphorical jar. After so many salty outbursts over the course of a month, well, there's your subscription. And for the price of a cup of coffee, you can help little Danielito get a well for his village.